That's the part that never left her. Not the cold, not the rain hitting her face like broken glass, not the concrete under her bare feet, or the way her nightgown soaked through in seconds. What stayed with her? What would stay with her for 5 years, 10 years, maybe the rest of her life, was the moment Roman Viscari looked at his pregnant wife standing in the doorway of their own home and turned his back without flinching. She had said his name. Just once. Roman. He kept walking. The iron gates closed behind her with a sound like a gunshot, and Elena Marlowe stood alone in the storm with nothing but the child she was carrying and the sudden, devastating knowledge that the man she loved was capable of something she had never once imagined. If that were you, if the person you trusted most in this world decided you were guilty before you could open your mouth, what would you do? Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, the kind that doesn't flinch, doesn't sugarcoat, and doesn't let anyone off easy, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it hits you the way I think it will, leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it means everything. Now let's go back to that rainy night in Chicago, because nothing that happened afterward makes sense unless you understand exactly how it began. The night started with a phone call Roman wasn't supposed to receive. He had been in his study, third floor, corner room, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the courtyard, when the encrypted line rang at 11:47. He'd been going over ledgers, the kind that existed in no official database, the kind his accountants handled with the understanding that asking questions was a career-ending decision. The Viscari organization didn't deal in ambiguity. It dealt in outcomes. Roman answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Carver, one of 3 people who had direct access to that line. Carver ran surveillance across 6 city districts. He was methodical, careful, and in 12 years of service had never once called to deliver anything other than verified intelligence. "I'm sending you something," Carver said. "No greeting, no preamble. Look at it before you say anything to anyone." The files arrived on Roman's secure tablet 40 seconds later. Photographs. Call logs. A recording, 43 seconds long, of a woman's voice describing the location of a meeting Roman had attended the previous Tuesday, a meeting that only 11 people on Earth knew had taken place. The voice belonged to Elena. Roman played it 3 times. Then he sat very still for almost 4 minutes, which for him was an eternity, because Roman Viscari was not a man who sat still. He was a man who acted. He was a man who had built an empire on the principle that hesitation was the same as surrender, that the moment you started weighing the cost of something was the moment your enemies started gaining ground. He pressed stop on the recording. Then he stood up and walked down 2 flights of stairs to the bedroom where Elena was asleep. She woke up when the light came on. She blinked at him, confused, pushing her dark hair out of her face with the slow, careful movements of a woman 7 months along who had learned to live inside a body that no longer felt entirely her own. "Roman?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "What time is it?" He didn't answer. He stood in the doorway with the tablet in his hand and looked at her like she was a problem he was calculating the cost of solving. "Get up," he said. The tone of it reached her before the words did. She had known Roman Viscari for 6 years. She had been married to him for 4. She knew the register of his voice the way a musician knows pitch. She could tell the difference between the Roman who was angry and the Roman who was dangerous, and what she heard standing in that doorway was something she had never encountered before, something that had gone past both. She sat up. "Roman, what's—" He set the tablet on the dresser without a word and stepped back. She looked at the screen. The call logs first, the photographs. Then she pressed play on the recording, and the room filled with her own voice describing a meeting she had no memory of attending, discussing details she had no way of knowing, with a calm and precision that was absolutely nothing like how she actually spoke. "That isn't me," she said. "I know what your voice sounds like." "Roman." She was on her feet now, one hand against the wall for balance. "Listen to me. I don't know where that came from, but I did not make that call. I wasn't even in the city on Tuesday. You know that? I was at the— You were at the waterfront clinic for your appointment." His voice was flat. "You were gone 4 hours. The meeting I attended lasted 40 minutes. I was at the clinic for 4 hours because Dr. Hess was backed up, And then she wanted to run an additional... She stopped. She was explaining herself. She had started explaining herself the way a person does when they already feel guilty, already on the defensive, and she watched something cross Roman's face that told her the explanation was already too late. He had already decided. "Roman, look at me." He looked at her. That was the worst part. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been something she could work with. What was on his face was something colder and more absolute, like a calculation that had already been completed, a verdict that had already been delivered, and whatever she said next would be registered as noise rather than information. "You need to leave," he said. The words didn't make sense for a moment. Her brain received them and couldn't locate a context that fit. "What?" "Tonight. Right now." "Roman, I'm pregnant." She said it the way you say something obvious to someone who seems to have lost track of basic facts, and she heard immediately how thin it sounded, how inadequate. "I know." He stepped back into the hallway. "There are people downstairs who will make sure you get wherever you're going safely. After that, her voice cracked on it. Not from sadness, from something harder. "After that what, Roman? You're going to have the mother of your child escorted off your property like she's one of your business problems? Like she's something that needs to be... You put 11 people at risk." Still that flat register, that terrible quiet. "You put me at risk. Whatever you were promised, whatever they offered you, it doesn't matter now." "I wasn't offered anything." She took a step toward him. "I didn't do this." He didn't move back. He just looked at her. And she saw it then. Not doubt, not hesitation, not even cruelty exactly. Just the absolute devastating certainty of a man who had spent 20 years trusting no one and had learned to treat love like any other liability. "I'll have your things sent wherever you go," he said. "The accounts we set up in your name..." "Stop!" She put her hand up. Her voice had gone quiet too now, down to something measured and deliberate, because Elena Marlowe had a spine she rarely showed Roman, and this was the moment it came to the surface. "Don't you dare make this about money. You're trying to buy your conscience a quiet night." She held his eyes. "I'm not taking your money. I'm not taking your things. I'm walking out of this house with nothing because you're standing there handing me nothing. And the only thing I want from you right now is 5 minutes to show you that recording is fabricated. Just 5 minutes." Roman was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the stairs. Not toward his study, not toward the phone, toward the front door. Elena stood in the bedroom doorway for 3 seconds, barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, with one hand resting against her rounded belly, and she looked at the man she had married and understood, with a clarity that felt almost surgical, that he was not going to give her 5 minutes. He was not going to examine the evidence. He had called someone who told him something, and he had believed it. And the marriage, the 4 years, the child they were expecting together, none of it was weight enough on the other side of that scale. She walked past him, didn't look back, went down the stairs and across the foyer and out the front door into a night that hit her like a physical blow. The cold, the rain, the wind off the lake, driving needles into her face. The 2 men Roman had mentioned were on either side of the path to the gate, big and silent in dark coats, and they walked her out without touching her. And she heard the gate close behind her, and she was standing on the sidewalk with no shoes, no phone, no coat, and water already soaking through the thin cotton of her nightgown. She didn't cry. She would think about that later, and it would feel significant in ways she couldn't quite name. She didn't cry. She just started walking. She made it 6 blocks before the car appeared. Black sedan, no plates she could make out in the rain and the dark. It came from the south end of the street and drove past her slowly. Too slowly. And something animal in Elena's chest registered the wrongness of it before her conscious mind caught up. She turned left at the next intersection without thinking about it, went down an alley between a hardware supply warehouse and what looked like a former factory, and the car appeared again at the far end. She ran. 7 months pregnant, barefoot on rain-slicked pavement, and she ran because whatever that car contained was not someone sent to help her, and the part of her brain that had lived inside Roman Viscari's world long enough to understand how these things worked had already done the math. Someone had orchestrated that recording. Someone had wanted her removed from that house. And once she was removed, with no phone and no witnesses and no one who could account for her whereabouts, she was significantly easier to make disappear permanently. She got through a gap in a chain-link fence by turning sideways and pressing through with one arm over her belly. Heard the car door open behind her. Heard footsteps on wet asphalt. Kept moving. What followed was 20 minutes she would never describe in full detail to anyone. The industrial district at midnight, abandoned loading docks and flooded underpasses, and twice she slipped and caught herself on her hands against brick walls, palms tearing against rough surface. She lost one pursuer when she went through a building that turned out to be connected to another structure 3 blocks east, a service corridor through an old distribution center, pitch dark except for emergency lights. And she moved through it with one hand on the wall and the other protective over her belly, and when she came out the other side, she was on a street she half recognized and the footsteps were gone. She found a 24-hour laundromat and pushed through the door dripping and wild-eyed, and the woman behind the counter, 60, heavy-set, reading a tabloid, looked up and took her in without a word and said, "Sit down, honey," with the flat practicality of someone who had seen worse come through that door. Her name was Dot. She gave Elena a towel, a pair of 2 large sweatpants from the lost and found pile, and eventually a phone to make a call. Elena had exactly one number memorized, not Roman's, not any of the numbers associated with his organization. A number she had committed to memory 2 years earlier out of a private instinct she'd never been able to fully explain to herself. A woman named Carla Reeves, who had been Elena's college roommate before Elena's life became what it became, and who lived in Oak Park and worked in hospital administration and had absolutely no connection to anything Viscari adjacent. Carla answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep, and Elena said, "It's me." And there was a pause, and then Carla said, "I'll come get you," without asking for an explanation, and that small, uncomplicated loyalty was enough to make Elena's throat tighten for the first time all night. While she waited, she sat under the laundromat's buzzing fluorescent lights with the towel around her shoulders and her hands flat on her belly, and she talked quietly to the child inside her. She didn't know what she was saying exactly. Something about being okay. Something about being safe. The way you talk to someone who needs to hear your voice regardless of the words, who needs only the evidence that you are still here and still present and haven't given up. The child moved, a slow, deliberate pressure against her palm. Elena pressed back. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, here we go." The man who had sent those files to Roman Viscari's encrypted tablet that night was not named Carver's. That detail would not become known for years. At the time, there was only Carver, reliable, methodical Carver, reporting intelligence through a secure channel, and no one thought to verify the chain of custody on material he delivered because Carver had never given anyone reason to. He had been with the organization since before Roman's father handed the operation over, and his record was spotless, and the idea that his credentials had been copied, his channel compromised by someone operating from inside the organization's own infrastructure, was the kind of thought that occurred to paranoid men. Roman Viscari was many things. Paranoid was not generally among them. He had always believed that paranoia was what happened to people who didn't have adequate intelligence networks, and he had spent considerable resources building exactly that. What he had not accounted for was the possibility that the intelligence network itself had been compromised, not from outside but from within, at a level so close to the center of operations that distinguishing it from the real thing required a kind of scrutiny. Roman had never thought to apply to people he trusted absolutely. His most trusted lieutenant was a man named Victor Sorin. Victor had been with Roman for 11 years. He was 44, quietly brilliant, the kind of person who managed to be indispensable without ever appearing to seek power directly, the sort of competence that makes itself invisible through consistency. He ran the logistics side of the operation with a precision that left Roman free to focus on broader strategic decisions, and he had been doing so long enough that large sections of the organization functioned on his authority as naturally as they functioned on Roman's. What Roman did not know, what no one knew except Victor himself and 2 men who were paid extremely well to not exist in any database, was that Victor Sorin had made a decision approximately 3 years earlier, a quiet, careful, extraordinarily patient decision to dismantle Roman Viscari's empire from the inside and absorb the pieces into an arrangement he was building with 3 rival organizations, none of whom knew the others were involved. The fabricated recording was not a spontaneous move. It was step 14 in a sequence Victor had planned across 18 months. Elena had to go first, not because she posed a direct threat, but because she was the one person in Roman's life whose judgment he sometimes deferred to, and Victor could not afford Roman having access to a voice that might slow his decisions down. More than that, Elena had a quality Victor had identified early and watched carefully. She noticed things, small inconsistencies, patterns that didn't quite fit. She had never worked in intelligence a day in her life, but she had the instincts for it, and Victor, who prided himself on reading people accurately, had clocked the way her eyes moved in a room, the quality of her attention, and concluded that given enough time, she would eventually notice something she shouldn't, so she had to go, quickly, cleanly, permanently. The men who followed her through the industrial district that night were not Romans. They were Victor's. And when they reported back that she had escaped, that she had moved through that building, found the service corridor, gotten clear, Victor absorbed the information without visible reaction and made a note. She was harder to remove than he'd expected. He filed that detail away and kept moving. There were 13 more steps in the sequence, and he was not a man who allowed one complication to derail a plan he'd been running for a year and a half. Elena was gone. Roman was shattered. The organization was temporarily destabilized by internal uncertainty about what had happened and what it meant. Victor could work with that. Carla arrived at the laundromat at 2 in the morning in a gray Honda with a cracked dashboard and a back seat full of grocery bags she'd never taken inside. She pulled up to the curb, and Elena got in, and Carla took one look at her and said nothing for almost a full minute, just drove. Then, very quietly, "The baby okay?" "Yes." "You okay?" "No." Carla nodded. "Okay," and kept driving. She took Elena back to Oak Park, installed her in the spare room that normally served as a home office, made her eat half a turkey sandwich even though it was almost 3 in the morning, and sat across from her at the kitchen table while Elena told her everything that had happened in controlled, precise language that still couldn't quite disguise how badly her hands were shaking. When Elena finished, Carla sat back and rubbed her face with both hands and said, "That son of a bitch," with feeling. "It wasn't him," Elena said. Or, it was him, but someone fed him that information deliberately. Someone who knew exactly which button to push. "Elena, he threw you out in the rain, pregnant, without shoes." "I know what he did." "Then why are you already making excuses for—" "I'm not making excuses, I'm making distinctions." Elena's voice had gone sharp. She caught herself. "I'm sorry. I know how it sounds, but if I spend the next 5 minutes being angry at Roman, I'm wasting time I should be using to figure out who manufactured that evidence and why. Because whoever it was, they didn't stop at getting me out of the house." She looked at her hands, the torn palms, grit still in the scrapes. "They tried to finish it." Carla was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You need a lawyer. You need a doctor. You need—" "I need a new name," Elena said, "and I need to disappear." Carla looked at her for a long moment. "How long?" she asked. Elena thought about the child, about the men in the rain, about a 43-second recording of a voice that sounded exactly like hers, saying things she had never said. "As long as it takes," she said. Outside, the rain kept coming down. It hit the window of Carla's kitchen in slow, uneven patterns, and Elena watched it without seeing it, already somewhere else in her mind, already building the architecture of a life she hadn't lived yet, already understanding, with a coldness that surprised her a little, that the woman who had walked out of Roman Viscari's gate barefoot and soaking was the last version of herself she intended to be that vulnerable ever again. The gates had closed. She was done waiting for them to open. 5 years is long enough to become someone else entirely. Elena didn't do it gradually. She didn't ease into the new identity the way most people imagine reinvention works. Slow accumulation of small changes, a haircut here, a new city there, gradual erosion of the old self until something unrecognizable takes its place. Elena did it the way she did everything after that night, with a precision that bordered on violence and a speed that left no room for sentiment. 6 weeks after Noah was born, 7 pounds 4 ounces, lungs like a trumpet, eyes that opened and looked at her with an alertness she found almost accusatory, she began. Not with the name came later. She began with the gaps. She identified everything she didn't know how to do and started learning, methodically, without the luxury of patience. Encryption protocols, financial forensics, threat assessment. She read until her eyes burned, took online certifications under a name that didn't exist yet, made contact through carefully vetted channels with a former Army intelligence officer named Dex Calloway, who owed Carla's brother a favor significant enough that he agreed to meet Elena once without asking why. He met her twice, then a third time. By the fourth meeting, he was asking her questions instead of answering them, and by the sixth, he told her flatly that she had a gift he'd only seen in two other people in 20 years of work, and both of them had ended up running operations for agencies that didn't appear on any government website. "I don't want to run an operation for someone else," Elena told him. "What do you want?" She looked at him across the table in the back booth of a diner in Evanston, with Noah asleep in a carrier against her chest, and said, "I want to build something nobody can take apart." Dex studied her for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, let's talk about how you fund it." Marlowe Global Security incorporated quietly in Delaware 18 months later, with a client list of exactly 3: a pharmaceutical executive who had received credible threats from a former employee, a mid-sized logistics company with evidence of internal fraud, and a nonprofit that suspected a board member of diverting funds. Small work. Careful work. The kind of work that built a reputation through results rather than marketing. By year 3, the client list was 47. By year 4, it was over 100, and Elena had 6 full-time staff and contracts with 2 former FBI analysts and a network of field operatives she could mobilize across 12 cities within 48 hours. She was not happy. She had not set out to be happy. She had set out to be competent and safe and in control of the variables that surrounded her son's life, and by those measures, she was succeeding. Noah was 4 years old and already relentlessly curious and entirely unafraid, which she took as evidence she was doing something right even when everything else felt uncertain. She thought about Roman occasionally, less than she expected to, more than she would have preferred. She never tried to find out what had happened to him. She understood the impulse, and she refused it the way she refused other things that would cost her equilibrium. With a flat, deliberate discipline that didn't require her to feel nothing, only to act as though she did until the feeling passed. The feeling didn't always pass, but she had learned to work around it, which was close enough. 1. The Kellner contract arrived on a Tuesday in March. It came through a referral from a federal prosecutor in Atlanta who had used Marlowe Global on an asset recovery matter the previous fall, and the initial brief was dry enough that Elena almost handed it to her senior analyst, Marcus Webb, without reading past the executive summary. A multinational financial services company suspected that a subsidiary in Eastern Europe was being used to route funds through a chain of shell entities, standard laundering architecture, the kind of work Marcus handled in his sleep. She read past the executive summary because something in the language of the brief felt slightly off. A specific phrase, legacy infrastructure with dormant regulatory relationships, that was technically accurate as a description of the shell network, but carried a precision that most corporate clients didn't naturally reach for. Someone had coached the language. Someone who knew the actual structure of what they were describing. She pulled the full file. The shell network had 17 layers. That was unusual. Most laundering architecture stopped at 8 or 10 because beyond that the administrative overhead started creating its own paper trail. 17 layers meant someone extremely cautious and extremely patient had built this, and they had built it over a long period of time, accumulating access to legitimate financial institutions slowly enough that each individual relationship looked unremarkable. She ran the ownership chains backward through the subsidiaries. Most of them dissolved into nominee structures in jurisdictions with minimal disclosure requirements. But 3 of them, 3 specific entities at the base of the chain, the oldest and most foundational components of the network, traced back through a sequence of transfers to an asset management firm registered in the Cayman Islands in the late 90s. The asset management firm's original filing listed 2 directors. One of them was a name she didn't recognize. The other was Roman Viscari. Elena sat at her desk for a long time after that. Her coffee went cold. Marcus knocked on her office door at some point, and she said, "Give me an hour," without looking up, and he heard something in her voice and didn't knock again. She had known, in an abstract way, that their paths might cross eventually. She had built her company carefully enough and had been selective enough about client work that she'd managed 5 years without a direct collision with anything in the Vescari orbit. But she had always known, in the way you know something you've decided not to think about, that Chicago was not a large enough city for that distance to hold indefinitely. She stared at the name on the screen for another 3 minutes. Then she opened a new case file and began to work. Marcus Webb was 38 and had spent 11 years at the FBI before a disagreement with his supervisor over the handling of a witness protection breach resulted in his resignation and a subsequent 6-month period he described only as recalibration. He was the first person Elena had hired who was genuinely better at certain things than she was, which she had recognized immediately and which was precisely why she'd hired him. She briefed him on the Kellner contract the following morning, leaving out the Vescari connection entirely. She gave him the Shell network documentation and the 17-layer chain and watched his face as he went through it. Whoever built this has been running it for at least a decade, he said. Longer. The base entities are from the late 90s. He looked up. That's not a laundering operation. That's infrastructure. Yes. For what? That's what we're being paid to find out. She kept her voice even. I want the flow analysis on the Eastern European subsidiaries first. Where the money is coming from, not just where it's going. Source identification is going to take time. If they're 17 layers deep on the output side, they're at least as careful on the input. I know. Start with the 3 entities in Cyprus. There's a pattern in the transfer timing I want you to look at. She slid a page of transaction records across the desk. The intervals are irregular, but they're not random. Someone is triggering these manually. Marcus looked at the page and was quiet for a moment. You already know what it is. I have a hypothesis, which you're not sharing. Which I'm not sharing yet, she said, because I want your analysis without my hypothesis in it. He studied her face the way he sometimes did when he was trying to decide whether she was being methodical or evasive, and then he picked up the page and said, "Give me 48 hours." He came back in 31. He knocked on her office door at 6 in the morning before anyone else was in the building, and she knew from the fact that he'd come that early that he'd found something that didn't sit right with him. Close the door, she said. He did. He put a folder on her desk and remained standing. The transfer intervals aren't operational, he said. They're not triggered by deal flow or by any business activity I can identify in the subsidiaries. They follow a separate cycle. Regular, but on a frequency that doesn't correspond to any normal financial reporting period. He paused. They correspond to payment schedules. Specifically, to the kind of payment schedule you'd use if you were distributing proceeds to multiple parties who each have to be paid at different intervals to avoid simultaneous activity spikes. Multiple recipients. At least 6. Possibly more. The routing gets complicated in the final layer, but I can identify 6 distinct endpoint patterns. He opened the folder and turned it toward her. 3 of them trace to organizations I recognize. The Pelletier Group out of Montreal, a construction conglomerate in Miami that showed up in a DOJ investigation 2 years ago and was never charged, and a logistics company called Sorin Transit. Elena's hand was resting on the desk. She kept it still. Sorin Transit, she said, incorporated 4 years ago. Ownership obscured, but the registration agent is the same firm that handles 3 other entities in the Shell chain. Whoever owns Sorin Transit is connected to whoever built this network. Marcus watched her. You know that name. It wasn't a question. She looked at the folder for a moment. Then she said, Victor Sorin was Roman Viscari's chief of operations. The room was very quiet. Was, Marcus said carefully, as far as I know. How long have you known this was connected to Viscari? I identified the base entity 2 days ago. And you brought me in without... He stopped, recalibrated. She could see him deciding which version of the conversation to have and settling on the professional one. Okay, what do you want to do with it? I want to know everything Victor Sorin has built in 5 years. Every entity, every relationship, every cash flow. I want to understand the full architecture before we take another step. Elena. He said her name with a weight that meant he was about to say something she might not want to hear. If Viscari's name is at the base of this network, and Sorin is the one running it, there are 2 possibilities. Either Viscari is still in control and Sorin is operating on his behalf, or Sorin has been running this independently of Viscari and using his name, his infrastructure, to do it. He paused. Those 2 possibilities have very different implications for what we do next. I know. We have an obligation to the client. I know that too. So which possibility do you think is more likely? Elena looked at the transaction records, at the 17-layer chain. at the payment schedules and the 6 endpoint patterns and the name Soren Transit in Marcus's careful handwriting. She thought about a recording that had lasted 43 seconds, about the quality of fabrication that went into it, not just the voice synthesis, but the specific details included, the details that only someone with deep operational knowledge could have known to include. Soren built it, she said. Viscari's name is at the base because Soren needed legitimate infrastructure to anchor the network, and he had access to Viscari's. But Soren is running this for himself. Marcus absorbed that, which means Viscari may not know his own assets are being used. Or he knows and he's compromised. Either way, our client hired us to trace a laundering network, not to navigate a mob internal dispute. I understand that. Do you? He wasn't being confrontational. He was being precise, which was what she'd hired him for. Because if you have a prior relationship with anyone connected to this, it creates a conflict. And I need you to tell me now whether that conflict changes what we do with what we find. Elena held his gaze for a moment. My prior relationship with Roman Viscari ended 5 years ago, she said. It ended badly. Whatever I may have felt then or feel now doesn't change the work. We follow the money. We build the full picture. Then we decide what to do with it. Marcus looked at her for another beat. Then he nodded once and picked up his folder. 48 more hours, he said. I want to bring in Yara for the Cyprus entities. Her contacts there are faster than mine. Keep it tight. The fewer people who know the full scope of this, the better. He nodded again and went to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, he said, the fact that you waited to tell me until you had something concrete isn't the worst call. I'd have done the same. I know, she said. He left. She sat alone in the early morning quiet and looked at the name Soren Transit until it stopped looking like a name and started looking like what it was, a thread. A single thread pulled from a knot so complex that pulling it wrong would tighten everything instead of loosening it. She needed to know how tight the knot was before she pulled. 3 weeks into the Kellner investigation, Elena's field operative in Warsaw came back with something that changed the shape of the entire problem. His name was Gregor Mast, ex-Polish military intelligence, and he had been doing location work for Marlowe Global for 2 years, with a consistency Elena valued above almost everything else. He didn't embellish. He didn't editorialize. He sent her raw observation and let her draw conclusions. What he sent from Warsaw was a set of surveillance photographs taken outside a private meeting at a hotel near the Old Town. 11 people entering and exiting over a 3-hour window. He'd identified 9 of them. 7 were known associates of Eastern European criminal organizations, mid-level, the kind of people who handled logistics and enforcement rather than strategy. 1 was a financial attorney whose name appeared in 2 previous DOJ investigations. The 9th was Victor Soren. He looked older than the photographs in Roman's files, heavier. There was something in his posture that read differently than Elena expected. She had built a mental image of Victor Soren over years of indirect analysis, and the reality was both more ordinary and more alarming than the image. He moved through the hotel entrance with the ease of someone who had been the most important person in the room so many times it had stopped requiring any effort. The 10th and 11th people in the photographs were not identified. Elena sent the photos to a contact at a federal agency she occasionally worked with and asked for identification assistance. The response came back in 18 hours. The 10th person was a low-level operative with no significant history. The 11th was a woman named Dana Marsh, who worked as a senior analyst at the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Victor Soren was meeting with a Treasury analyst in Warsaw. Elena read the identification report 3 times. Then she called Marcus. He has someone inside, she said when he picked up. Treasury? FinCN, which means every time an agency runs his financial entities through the monitoring system, someone is positioned to see the query and move assets before it triggers anything actionable. Marcus was quiet for a moment. How long? Marsh has been at FinCEN for 6 years. The network has been running in its current form for at least 4. So he built the inside relationship before he needed it. He builds everything before he needs it. She stood at the window of her office, looking down at the street. Marcus, this isn't opportunistic. This isn't someone who stumbled into a good position and started exploiting it. This is a systematic, long-term construction. He spent years setting up each component before activating it. including the Viscari infrastructure. Including that. Which means, Marcus stopped. Say it. Which means whatever happened 5 years ago was part of it. Whatever move he made that destabilized the organization, that was deliberate. That was step one. Elena didn't respond immediately. She watched a delivery truck pull up to the curb below, and a man get out and stand in the cold morning air, consulting his phone. Ordinary detail. The kind of detail that insists on existing regardless of what else is happening around it. We have a problem, she said. Which one specifically? If Soren has been systematically dismantling Viscari's organization while maintaining plausible separation from it, using the assets without appearing to control them, then at some point the dismantling reaches a stage where it becomes visible, where Viscari realizes what's happening. If he hasn't already, and if he has, she stopped. If he has, then Soren knows he knows, Marcus said, and Soren doesn't leave loose ends. The weight of that settled in the room between them, even though they were on a phone. We need to move faster, Elena said. Pull everything. Full financial mapping, every entity we've identified, every endpoint. I want a complete picture in 72 hours. That's aggressive. I know, do it anyway. She hung up and stood at the window for another moment. The delivery man had gotten back in his truck. The street was empty. She was trying to locate in herself some uncomplicated professional detachment, the kind she'd spent 5 years building, the kind that let her look at a case as a set of variables to be mapped and solved, rather than a live thing with jagged edges that could reach back and cut her. She almost found it. She found the outline of it, the shape of how it was supposed to feel. But there was something in the phrase Soren doesn't leave loose ends that refused to be processed as abstraction. Because 5 years ago, she had been a loose end, and he had sent men after her through an industrial district in the rain. The call came from a blocked number at 11:40 on a Thursday night. Elena was in her apartment, a clean, spare two-bedroom in Lincoln Park that she had chosen specifically because it had 2 exit routes and a building manager who had been paid sufficiently to value discretion. Noah was asleep down the hall. She was going over Yara's Cypress analysis with a highlighter and a second cup of coffee when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. Blocked numbers were not unusual in her line of work, but she had a protocol about late-night contact from unknown sources, and the protocol said verify before engaging. She answered on the 6th ring. Elena Marlowe, said the voice on the other end. It was a man's voice, careful, precise, carrying the particular quality of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now executing it. Who is this? She said. You don't know me. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I work for someone who has become aware of your current investigation, and that someone asked me to pass along a message. I don't receive messages from anonymous intermediaries. I understand, but this one is time-sensitive. A pause. Victor Soren knows you're looking at him. The coffee cup was halfway to her mouth. She set it down without drinking. He identified the Kellner contract as an intelligence operation 3 days ago, the voice continued. He doesn't know yet who's running it, but he's running his own analysis, and you have a window. His estimate is he'll have a name within a week, possibly less. Elena's brain was moving fast, cataloging the implications. If Soren knew the investigation existed, the first priority was isolating which part of the architecture he'd detected. Which entity, which transaction pattern, which layer had shown an anomaly visible enough to trigger his attention. Who are you working for? She said. Someone who has his own reasons for wanting Soren's operation exposed. That's not an answer. It's the answer I'm authorized to give. Then we're done. She moved to hang up. Roman Viscari, the voice said. She didn't hang up. The silence lasted several seconds. He knows you're in Chicago, the voice said. He's known for about 8 months. He found out when Marlowe Global did work for a client whose attorney happened to mention the company to someone in Viscari's orbit. Another pause. He didn't reach out before now because, and I'm passing along his exact words, he didn't think he had the right. Elena was standing very still. She could hear Noah's white noise machine from down the hall, the low, steady hiss of it, and she focused on that sound for a moment because it was uncomplicated and present, and she needed something uncomplicated and present. He wants to meet, the voice said. No. He has information about Soren's operation that your financial mapping can't give you, structural information, internal architecture that predates the documents you're working from. I said no. He also has something else. A beat. He has the original recording, the one from 5 years ago. He tracked the source 18 months after everything happened. He never did anything with it because by then, the voice stopped, recalibrated. He has the original file with the metadata intact. Proof of fabrication. He held it because he didn't know how to reach you without making your situation less safe. Elena sat down. She hadn't decided to sit. Her legs just made the decision independently. Where, she said. There's a warehouse on the south branch of the river, industrial district off West Lumber. He'll be there Saturday at 9 in the evening with 2 people, unarmed. He asks that you come with whoever you trust. And if it's a setup, then you walk away and you're no worse off than you are now. The voice paused. He said to tell you one more thing. He said, and these are his words, that he's been wrong about a lot of things. But the thing he's been most wrong about is the thing he can't fix. He just wants the chance to say that in person. The line went dead. Elena sat in her living room with the phone in her hand and the Cypress analysis spread across her coffee table and Noah's white noise machine humming steadily from down the hall, and she thought about a gate closing in the rain, and about a 43-second recording, and about the word fabrication in the voice of a stranger passing along a message from a man she had spent 5 years not allowing herself to fully grieve. She thought about Soren knowing her name within a week. She thought about the 17-layer network and the treasury analyst in Warsaw, and the men who had chased her through an industrial district when she was 7 months pregnant and had nowhere to go. She put the phone on the table. Then she picked up a pen and wrote 2 words on the edge of the Cypress analysis. Saturday, 9. Not because she trusted it, not because she had forgiven anything or processed anything, or arrived at any clean emotional resolution about what Roman Viscari had done and what it had cost her. Because the case had just entered a phase where the next wrong step didn't get corrected. It got buried. And she had not survived 5 years of building something from nothing in order to let Victor Soren decide how this ended. Saturday came in cold and overcast, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain and just threatening it, and Elena spent most of the day doing things that had nothing to do with the meeting. She took Noah to his Saturday soccer practice at 8 in the morning and stood on the sideline with a coffee she barely touched and watched him chase the ball with the focused, slightly chaotic energy of a 5-year-old who understood the general concept of the game but found the rules negotiable. His coach was a patient man named Terry who had learned early that Noah operated best when given instructions and then left alone to interpret them, which Elena recognized as a management approach she had essentially developed herself. Noah scored twice. Both times he looked over at her immediately, not with excitement exactly, but with a kind of quick checking quality. Did you see? And both times she raised her coffee cup because that was their signal, and both times his face shifted into something she could only describe as satisfaction before he turned back to the game. She drove him to Carla's afterward. Carla lived in Oak Park still. Same house, different car. She had a husband now, a quiet accountant named Pete, who made good pasta and had the useful quality of asking no questions about Elena's work. Carla met them at the door and took Noah's bag and looked at Elena over his head with the particular expression that meant she'd already been told more than she wanted to know. "What time?" Carla said. 9. "I'll call you by midnight." "And if you don't call by midnight, then call Marcus." Elena had already given Carla the number. She crouched down to Noah's level. He was already pulling off his cleats, deeply focused on the task, the laces apparently having personally offended him. "Hey." He looked up. "I have to work tonight. I'll be back tomorrow morning." Early? Reasonably early. He considered this with the judicial seriousness he applied to most things. "Can we get pancakes?" "Yes." "Okay." He went back to the laces. She kissed the top of his head. He tolerated it the way he tolerated most physical affection, with a faint air of patience, as though he understood it mattered to her and was willing to accommodate it within reason. She stood up and found Carla watching her. "Be careful," Carla said. "I'm always careful." "You're usually careful. Tonight you're walking into a warehouse to meet the man who threw you out in the rain when you were pregnant." "I know what I'm doing." Carla looked at her for one more moment, then she stepped aside. "Pancakes," she said. "Make sure you actually come back for them." Marcus was already at the location when Elena arrived. He'd gone 2 hours early with another operative named Soles, former DEA, built like a doorframe, spoke rarely and accurately, to walk the perimeter and clear the interior. The warehouse was exactly what the anonymous caller had described. Industrial district off West Lumber, South Branch, a building that had been out of active use long enough for the signage on the exterior to have faded to near illegibility. Marcus met her at the south entrance. 3 vehicles arrived 20 minutes ago, he said without preamble. 2 men got out of the first, 1 from each of the others. One of the solo men went back to the second vehicle and waited. The other 4 went inside. Which means Roman has 5 people here, not 2. Yes. Marcus watched her process this. You want to walk? Elena looked at the building. She thought about the metadata on a fabricated recording. She thought about 17 layers of shell entities and a treasury analyst in Warsaw, and a week, maybe less, before Victor Sorin had her name. No, she said. They went in through the south entrance. Solis came in through a secondary access point on the west side, which Elena had identified from the building schematic Marcus had pulled that afternoon. The interior smelled of old metal and river damp, and the only light came from 4 portable work lamps set up in a rough rectangle in the center of the main floor, creating an island of visibility in a large dark space. Roman was standing in the middle of it. He looked like 5 years had happened to him, which they had, but not in the way she'd half expected. She had constructed a version of him in her mind that had either remained exactly as she remembered or had softened into something diminished, and the reality was neither. He was thinner, and there was something in his posture that hadn't been there before, much. Not weakness exactly, but the absence of the particular armored quality she'd always associated with him, that physical certainty that used to fill a room. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched her walk toward him, and his face did several things in quick succession that she suspected he hadn't intended to let happen. She stopped 8 feet away. Marcus remained 4 steps behind her to her right. She didn't look at Roman's 2 men, positioned at the edges of the light. She looked at Roman. You said unarmed, she said. They are. His voice was the same. She hated, briefly, that his voice was the same. I said 2 people. I lied about that. I'm sorry. Why? Because the last time I felt completely secure about a situation, I made the worst decision of my life. He held her gaze. I wasn't willing to do that again. The silence between them had a specific texture. Not empty, not comfortable, but loaded in a way that wasn't entirely about threat. Elena recognized it and kept her voice level. You said you had the original recording. He reached into his jacket, slowly, the movement telegraphed and deliberate, and produced a drive. Small, black, the kind of encrypted thumb drive that cost more than it looked. He held it out. She didn't take it. Tell me what's on it. The original fabricated file, the synthesis algorithm used to generate the voice. The metadata from the encrypted channel it was transmitted through, which traces back to a server cluster that Victor's people set up 18 months before that night. He kept his arm extended. And a second file, records of the 2 men who followed you, their employment history within the organization, documentation showing they were reporting to Victor, not to me, for 3 years before that night. Elena looked at the drive. Then she crossed the distance and took it. She turned it over in her hand once and put it in her jacket pocket. When did you know? She said. That it was Victor. Roman let out a slow breath. 14 months after. I started seeing patterns in the operational decisions he'd been making. Small things, individually. Together they showed a direction I hadn't authorized, hadn't even known about. I started looking backward, and the further back I looked, the worse it got. He paused. By the time I understood the full shape of what he'd done, you'd been gone for over a year and I had no idea how to find you. And then when I did find out where you were, 8 months ago, your intermediary said. 8 months ago. He looked at her steadily. I didn't know how to reach out without putting you at risk. Victor's people are still active. If he saw any contact between us before I had something concrete to offer you, so you waited until my investigation gave you an opening. I waited until I could give you something worth the risk of making contact. Elena looked at him for a moment. She was aware of Marcus behind her, aware of the 2 men at the perimeter of the light, aware of the sounds of the building settling around them. Old metal, river wind. She was doing the thing she'd trained herself to do, processing information with as much separation from emotion as she could manage, cataloging what was verifiable versus what was assertion. The drive was verifiable. The metadata would either check out or it wouldn't. Everything Roman was saying could be assessed against the documentation. What she couldn't assess was why she was standing in a warehouse in the dark, talking to him instead of having Marcus receive the drive through the intermediary and walking away clean. "What do you want from this?" she said. Roman was quiet for a moment. "Victor's operation has grown past what I can dismantle alone. His financial network is tied into federal structures I can't touch. The internal people he's turned. I can identify them, but I can't move against them without triggering a response I can't contain." He paused. "You can. Your company, your contacts, your network. You can expose this in a way that's clean and documentable, and that doesn't give Victor any avenue to retaliate without making himself visible to federal attention. And what happens to you when that exposure happens? I've been preparing for that for about 2 years." He said it with a flatness that told her he'd already made peace with the answer. "The organization gets dismantled. Whatever cooperation I can provide to federal authorities, I provide. Whatever accountability applies to me, applies to me." A pause. "I'm not trying to survive this clean. I'm trying to make sure it happens correctly." Marcus spoke from behind her for the first time. "Mr. Vescari, the warehouse in Warsaw last Tuesday, was that on your radar?" Roman shifted his gaze to Marcus. "Yes. Soren is meeting with mid-level Eastern European operators and a FinCEN analyst. That Warsaw meeting, do you know what was discussed?" Roman's jaw tightened. He's consolidating. He's been running the parallel organizations as separate streams, but he's been moving toward integration for about 6 months. Warsaw was part of that. He's trying to put everything under one operational structure while maintaining the federal cover. A beat. Which means he's close to the end of the assembly phase. Once the integration is complete, the individual streams become significantly harder to trace because they lose their distinct signatures. "How close?" Elena said. "Weeks, maybe less." The word landed with a specific weight. Elena looked at the drive in her hand. "I need 48 hours with this before I make any decisions about next steps," she said. "I understand. And I need your internal documentation. Whatever you have on Soren's people, the turned operatives, the communication channels he's been using inside your organization. All of it. I can have it to you by morning." "Through Marcus." "Not directly." She met his eyes. "We're not partners yet. If the metadata on this drive checks out and your documentation holds up under analysis, we'll talk about what comes next. If anything is fabricated or selective, it's not. If it is," she continued, same level register, "then this conversation is the last one we have. And I take everything we have on Soren directly to the FBI without you in the picture at all." Roman nodded once. No negotiation, no qualification. Just the nod. She turned and walked back toward the south entrance. Marcus fell in beside her. They were almost to the door when Roman spoke behind them. "Elena?" She stopped, didn't turn. "I know saying I'm sorry doesn't do anything." His voice was very quiet, the sound of it just reaching her across the dark space. "I know it doesn't fix what I cost you. I'm not saying it to fix anything. I'm saying it because it's true, and you deserve to hear it said directly." The building settled around them. Somewhere outside, a barge was moving on the river, the low engine sound reaching through the walls. Elena didn't respond. She pushed through the door and walked out into the cold air. She didn't feel better. She hadn't expected to. The metadata checked out. Yara had it analyzed by 6 the following morning, cross-referencing the server cluster documentation against known infrastructure databases. And by 8, she was in Elena's office with printed results and an expression that was working hard to be neutral and not quite getting there. "It's real," Yara said. "The synthesis algorithm is consistent with a voice generation tool that was commercially available in modified form about 6 years ago through gray market channels. The server cluster is registered to a Lithuanian tech firm that dissolved 18 months before the recording was made. This," she tapped the documentation, "this is significant. This could support a fabrication case in federal court." Elena looked at the printed results. "And Roman's organizational documentation?" "Marcus is going through it now. He called it comprehensive and credible, which from Marcus means he's pretty impressed." Yara paused. "There are names in there, Elena. People currently active in what look like legitimate positions. One of them is in city government. One is in a regional banking operation that we've seen referenced in the Kellner financial chain. Which bank? Yara told her. Elena set down the results. The bank was one of the 3 legitimate financial institutions she'd flagged in the second week of the investigation, one of the anchor relationships that gave Soren's network its regulatory credibility. If Roman's documentation placed a turned operative inside that institution, it meant Soren didn't just have a buffer against regulatory detection. He had active manipulation of the reporting chain. How exposed are we? She said. In terms of Soren knowing we're looking at him? In terms of how much he knows versus how much he suspects? I thought about it. The anonymous caller said he'd detected the Kellner contract as an intelligence operation. If that's accurate, he knows someone is running an active investigation. He may or may not have identified Marlowe Global specifically. He definitely doesn't know about the drive or about your meeting with Viscari. A pause. Yet. The word yet landed in the room and stayed there. Elena's phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Different from the blocked number that had called Thursday, a different format. She answered. The voice that came through was not the careful intermediary voice from before. It was a woman's voice, and it was afraid. Ms. Marlowe, my name is Dana Marsh. I work at FinCEN. A trembling exhale. I think I'm in a great deal of trouble, and I don't know who else to call. Elena was on her feet. Yara looked at her sharply. Elena held up one finger and moved to the window. How did you get this number? Victor Soren gave it to me. The fear in the voice spiked on his name. He said if I ever needed to reach someone who could help me, this was who to call. He gave it to me 8 months ago. I don't know why he had it or what it means that he gave it to me. 8 months ago. The same time Roman had located her. Elena's mind moved through the implications fast. Ms. Marsh, where are you right now? I'm in my car, in a parking garage in the Loop. I didn't want to go home. A shaking breath. Last night someone broke into my apartment. They didn't take anything. They went through my files, my personal computer. I have documentation that There are things I've been doing that I need to explain to someone. Not on this line, Elena cut across her. I need you to listen to me carefully. Do not go home. Do not go to your office. Stay in the parking garage. Stay in your car. Lock the doors. She looked at Yara, who was already reaching for her jacket. I'm going to send someone to you in the next 20 minutes. Her name is Yara. She'll come to you alone and she'll say the word Cyprus, so you know it's her. Can you wait 20 minutes? Yes. A pause. Ms. Marlowe, I've been doing things that I'm not. I know what I've done. I know what it means. I'm not trying to get out of it. Her voice broke slightly. I need someone to know what I know before something happens to me. 20 minutes, Elena said. Stay in the car. She hung up. Yara was already heading for the door. She has a break-in and she's scared, Elena said. She's also a federal employee who has been facilitating financial crime for at least 4 years, which means she has information and she's calculating that offering it is her best protection right now. Handle her carefully. Don't promise her anything until I know what she has. Yara nodded and was gone. Elena stood alone in her office. The printed metadata analysis was on her desk. Roman's organizational documentation was with Marcus down the hall. Dana Marsh was sitting in a Loop parking garage, having apparently decided that the calculus of her situation had shifted enough that turning toward exposure felt safer than continuing to face away from it. Something had changed in Soren's operation in the last 48 hours. Something that had made him search Marsh's apartment and that had made Marsh afraid enough to call a number she'd been holding for 8 months without using. Elena called Marcus. I need everything you have on Soren's timeline for integration. Specifically, anything that suggests he's moved up his schedule. I was about to call you, Marcus said. There's a transaction in the documentation from Roman, dated 4 days ago. A large consolidation transfer. It's not in the pattern we've been tracking. How large? He told her. That's not a phase transfer, she said. That's a liquidation move. Yeah. His voice was tight. He's not weeks away from completing integration. He's already past it. The Warsaw meeting was an assembly. It was the final briefing. The implication hit her cold and clear. Soren's network was complete. It had been complete possibly took the Kellner contract, the 17 layers, the federal contacts, the integration of 6 separate criminal streams. It was already done, already running, and everything she'd been analyzing as a network under construction was a network already operational and protected. Which meant Soren's concern about the Kellner investigation wasn't about protecting something he was building. It was about protecting something he'd already built. And the break-in at Marsh's apartment, the search of a trusted insider's personal files, was not standard precaution. It was someone checking whether Marsh had talked. Marcus, her voice had gone very quiet. The city government name in Roman's documentation. Which department? Marcus checked. He told her. Elena's throat tightened. The department handled building and infrastructure permits, including permits for industrial facilities, including specifically the category of permit that would be required for a private facility in the Chicago metro area to host large-scale logistics operations. She pulled up Marlowe Global's client intake records on her computer, found the Kellner contract referral chain. The federal prosecutor in Atlanta who'd made the referral, she pulled his contact file, checked the relationship chain. The prosecutor had attended a conference 8 months ago at which his attendance list, published afterward in conference materials, was publicly accessible. Also on the attendance list, a mid-level official from the Chicago Infrastructure Department whose name matched the name in Roman's documentation. The referral chain that had brought the Kellner contract to Marlowe Global ran through a man who had sat in the same room as one of Soren's planted officials 8 months ago. The contract was not a coincidence. She understood it now with a cold, sudden clarity that was almost physical. The sensation of a mechanism clicking into place, the recognition of a shape you'd been looking at from the wrong angle. Victor Soren had known about Marlowe Global for longer than a week. He had known about it, specifically and in operational detail, for months. He had been tracking Elena's company, and when he decided it was time to manage the exposure risk she represented, not eliminate it, not yet, but manage it, observe it, understand its current state of knowledge. He had arranged for a contract to land in her lap that was specifically constructed to pull her toward the parts of his network he had already secured and away from the parts he was still assembling. The Kellner contract was bait. She had been running an investigation for 3 weeks into the sections of Soren's network he wanted her running an investigation into. She stood very still at her desk. Her phone rang. It was a number she'd had in her contacts for exactly 4 days, Roman's intermediary. She answered. Change of plans, the careful voice, but with something strained underneath it now. There's been a development on our end. Roman needs you to know. Victor has a name. He has your name, not the company. You personally. How long has he had it? A pause that lasted a beat too long. We don't know. We just became aware that he has it. What else does he have? We're trying to determine that. What is the development that prompted this call? Another pause. 2 of our people are not responding, the voice said. They were tasked with monitoring Victor's communications. They missed their check-in 4 hours ago. We've sent someone to their location and they're a breath. They're gone. The location is clean, no signs of struggle. Elena closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Opened them. Clean location, no struggle, professionals. The kind of removal that happened when the person doing it had time and resources, and the people being removed hadn't seen it coming because they trusted the wrong channel. Victor knows Roman has been running surveillance on him, she said. We believe so. Which means he knows Roman is preparing to move against him. Yes. Which means he's going to move first. She was already around her desk, already reaching for her jacket. Tell Roman to pull everyone he has exposed, immediately. Anyone who's been running active surveillance or communication monitoring on Victor's operation, pull them now. He's already, and tell him that Noah's location may be compromised. She said it with a steadiness she did not feel. Victor has had my name for an unknown period of time. If he's done basic background on me, he has my personal life. I need Roman's people watching the Oak Park address starting right now. She was already dialing Carla on the second phone before the intermediary responded. The line rang, once, twice, 3 times. Carla picked up on the 4th ring, and in the half-second before she said anything, Elena heard background sounds that she analyzed instantly and completely. The television, the sound of Pete's voice somewhere in the house, the ordinary noise of a Sunday morning interior. No alarm, no disruption. Hey, Carla said, sleep rough and unsuspecting. Are you at home? Yeah, we just Don't leave the house. Lock the front and back doors right now and don't open them for anyone until I call you back. Noah is there? He's watching cartoons, Elena. What? Lock the doors, Carla. Right now, while I'm on the phone. She heard Carla move, heard the sound of a deadbolt, heard her say something to Pete in a low, urgent voice, and then she came back. Done. What's happening? I'm 20 minutes away. I'll explain when I get there. She was already moving toward the office door. Does anyone know Noah is at your place? Anyone you've mentioned it to? Anyone who might have... No one, Carla said. You know I don't talk about... The sound that came through the phone was not a crash. It was quieter than that. A single sharp impact, like something hitting a wall, and then Pete's voice saying something indistinct, and then silence. Carla. Elena's voice stayed level even as she broke into a run. Carla, talk to me. Nothing. Carla. The line was still connected. She could hear the background sounds of the house. The television still running, a cartoon voice still chattering obliviously in a room somewhere, and then a new sound, footsteps, more than one set, and then Noah's voice. Hey! Cut off mid-syllable with a softness that was worse than anything loud would have been. And then a man's voice, not hurried, not raised, speaking with the flat efficiency of someone reading from a task list. Ms. Marlowe, we have your son. Come alone to the address I'm about to give you and come now. He gave her an address. He disconnected. Elena was in the stairwell of her building, running down 4 flights, and every instinct she had was screaming simultaneously. The tactical instinct that said, don't go alone, never go alone, and the mother instinct that overrode everything else like a system crash, reducing the world to one fact and one fact only. Noah's voice had been cut off mid-syllable, and she did not know if he was hurt, and she could not bear the not knowing even for the time it would take to be strategic about this. She hit the building's ground floor door and burst through it into the cold morning air and ran for her car, and her hands were shaking for the first time in 5 years, the first genuine, uncontrolled physical response she'd had since a rainy night in an industrial district when she'd had nothing and no one and nowhere to go. She had built 5 years of competence and control and professional distance and strategic thinking, and in the span of 30 seconds. Victor Soren had taken all of it and reduced it to the most fundamental thing she was, a mother whose child was in danger and who would burn every careful structure she'd built to the ground without hesitation, if that was what getting him back required. She started the car. The address Soren's man had given her was 12 minutes away, and she had 12 minutes to decide what version of herself was walking through that door. She drove the first 4 minutes on pure adrenaline, which she recognized and consciously fought against because adrenaline made you fast, and it made you stupid, and she could not afford stupid right now. At the first red light, she forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, count to 4, out through the mouth, count to 4. She'd learned it from a trauma psychologist she'd contracted 2 years ago to train her field operatives in stress response management, and she'd sat in on the sessions telling herself she was there for professional observation and knowing, even then, that she was there because she needed it too. The breathing helped. Marginally. Enough. She called Marcus with one hand while driving with the other. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd already known something was wrong. She could hear it in the single word he said. Tell me. She told him. The address? Noah. Carla. The timeline. 12 words or fewer per sentence because her brain was still running hot, and more than 12 words felt like waste. When she finished, Marcus said, "Don't go in alone," with a flatness that wasn't a suggestion. I know. Elena, I know, Marcus, I'm not going in alone. I need you at the perimeter with Solus, and I need you there before I arrive. A pause. Call Roman. Silence for 2 seconds. You sure? Victor has people who move clean and quiet. Roman has people who know Victor's operational patterns. She took a corner faster than she should have, and the car's tires made a sound she ignored. Call him. Tell him the address. Tell him what's happened. Tell him I need everyone he can move in the next 10 minutes. And if this is still a setup, if the whole sequence, Roman, the drive, Marsh, all of it, then I'm walking into a trap with backup instead of walking into it alone. She took another breath. The address is a shipping facility. I looked it up. It's registered to a logistics company that dissolved 2 years ago. Marcus, it's Soren Transit. A beat. He wants you on his ground, Marcus said. He wants both of us on his ground, Roman and me. Together, exposed, in a place he controls. She thought through it as she spoke. Noah isn't the objective. Noah is the mechanism. He gets us there, he gets us contained, and then he finishes what he started 5 years ago. Both loose ends at once. I'm calling Roman now. Solus is already in the car. The sound of Marcus moving, a door, wind. 10 minutes. Do not go inside before I'm there. Drive fast, she said, and hung up. She had 8 minutes left. She used 4 of them to call the federal prosecutor contact she'd worked with in Atlanta. He answered, sounding confused and mildly annoyed, and she said his name once, sharply, and then said, "The Kellner investigation. I need you to listen to me for 90 seconds and not talk." She gave him everything compressed into the tightest possible package. Soren's network, the FinCEN contact, the liquidity transfer from Roman's documentation, the fact that everything was operational and active, and that within the next 48 hours, it would either be exposed or buried. She gave him Marcus Webb's number. She gave him the location she was driving to. If you don't hear from Marcus by tonight, go to the FBI directly. Don't go through FinCEN. Assume any channel connected to FinCEN is compromised. Ms. Marlowe, I can't just... 90 seconds, she said. I said 90 seconds and I'm at 85. Will you do it? A pause. Yes. Thank you. She hung up. The shipping facility appeared on the left side of the road at the 8-minute mark. A long, low building behind a chain-link perimeter. The kind of anonymous industrial structure that existed in the spaces between highways and river access roads all over the south side. 2 vehicles were visible in the lot. Lights were on inside, visible through the narrow windows set high in the walls. Elena pulled past without stopping and went 2 blocks further and parked behind a supply depot that was closed on Sundays. She got out of the car and stood in the cold air and checked her sidearm. The Glock she carried in a shoulder holster under her jacket, which she'd strapped on in the elevator coming down from her office, hands working from muscle memory because her conscious mind had already been somewhere else entirely. She had 3 minutes before Marcus's estimated arrival. She used them to walk the exterior perimeter of the facility from a distance, staying close to structures along the road's edge, moving the way Dex Calloway had taught her. Not sneaking, not hunched, just a person walking with a particular kind of purposeful ordinariness that didn't invite attention. She counted visible entry points, assessed the lighting, noted the vehicle positions in the lot, and what they told her about interior deployment. She was on the north side of the building when a car came up fast from the west and pulled in behind the supply depot where her vehicle was. Not Marcus. Too soon. She pressed back against the chain link and watched. And then the driver's door opened, and Roman Vescari got out. Moving at a pace that told her whatever call Marcus had made, Roman had been already moving before it came in. He saw her in 15 seconds. He came across the distance between them without running, but close enough to it that the distinction was technical. "How many?" he said. "I count 2 vehicles in the lot, minimum 4 inside based on the contact methodology. Victor uses groups of 6 for facility operations. He doesn't like working with less." Roman's jaw was tight, a muscle working in it. He looked at the building and then back at her. "Noah, I don't know his condition." The call was clean and fast, professional. Something moved across Roman's face that wasn't tactical. She registered it and kept going. "Your people. How many can you get here now?" 4 are 90 seconds out. I have 2 more at a 10-minute response." He looked at her directly. "Elena, if Victor is running this personally, is he? He prefers to be present for termination operations. Always has." A beat. "Yes, he's in there." Marcus's car came in from the east at its speed and stopped behind Roman's vehicle. Solus was out before it fully stopped, already assessing the building sightlines with the methodical efficiency of someone for whom this was not a novel situation. Marcus came to Elena's position with his weapon already drawn and held low. 4 of Roman's people coming in from the north access road, he said. I coordinated with them on the way. Entry points, Elena said. Main entrance, south face, loading dock, east side. Service access, west. It's a smaller door, personnel only. Marcus looked at the building. If he's using Victor's standard 6-person deployment, he'll have 2 on the main entrance, 1 each on the dock and service access, 2 interior with the hostage. Or, Roman said, He's changed the deployment because he knows I know his standard patterns. He's been running adapted operations for the last 2 years specifically because he knows what I expect him to do. Elena looked at Roman. So what does he do when he adapts? He inverts. Heavy interior, minimal exterior. He sacrifices perimeter coverage for interior control because he believes the situation is already contained by the time exterior deployment matters, which means the main entrance is lighter than we'd expect, and the interior is not. Marcus and Elena exchanged a look. Solus was already on his phone, relaying something in a low voice to the Romans' approaching people. I'm going in the main entrance, Elena said. I'm going with you, Roman said simultaneously. She looked at him for a moment, then, Marcus takes the loading dock with 2 of your people. Solus takes the service access. She turned to Marcus. The moment you're inside, make noise. I want Victor's people looking in multiple directions. And Victor himself? Marcus said. Victor is mine, Elena said. Nobody argued with the way she said it. The main entrance was a single steel door set in the south face of the building, and it was unlocked, which was a statement. An unlocked door at a location like this wasn't an oversight. It was an invitation, and an invitation at this level from this person was a form of contempt. The message being that he wasn't worried about what came through the door because he'd already determined the outcome. Elena pushed through it with Roman 1 step behind her and to the right. The interior of the facility was a single open floor plan, roughly the size of a city block, with support columns at regular intervals and a network of old conveyor infrastructure running at mid-height that created a secondary level of visual obstruction. The ceiling was high, and the light was industrial. A combination of overhead fluorescents, perhaps half of which were functional, and the work lamps that Soren's people had brought in and positioned to their advantage. She identified 3 men in the first 4 seconds. 1 near the entrance they'd come through, now behind them. She tracked his position peripherally without turning. 2 more at the center of the floor, flanking a setup that her eyes reached and then locked onto with a totality that temporarily displaced everything tactical. Noah was seated on a chair at the center of the space. His hands were zip-tied in front of him. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on at soccer practice, the blue windbreaker, the grass-stained track pants. He was not visibly hurt. His eyes found her the moment she entered, and he did the thing that hit her like a physical impact. He didn't call out, didn't cry, just looked at her with an expression of absolute unwavering conviction that she was going to fix this. The way he looked at her when something was broken or frightening, and he believed without question that she was the person who made broken things work again. She held his gaze for 1 second, 1 deliberate, visible second, enough for him to read what she needed him to read. I see you. Stay still. I'm here. Then she moved her eyes away from him because she could not afford to keep them there. Victor Soren was standing 20 feet behind Noah's chair. He looked exactly like the surveillance photographs from Warsaw, and he didn't look like them at all because photographs couldn't carry what the room carried when he stood in it. A quality of compressed attention that she'd heard Roman's people describe over the years, and hadn't fully credited until this moment. He was watching her the way a person watches something they've been curious about for a long time and are finally getting to examine directly. Ms. Marlowe, he said. Not loud. The acoustics of the space carried it easily. I've been looking forward to this. She stopped walking at a distance that put 2 columns between her and the man behind her and gave her a sightline to Noah that wasn't directly through Victor. Roman had stopped 3 feet to her right. Victor. Roman's voice was completely flat. Victor looked at him. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite amusement, not quite contempt. Something that lived between them. You brought her here. Or she brought you. I wasn't sure which it would be. He tilted his head slightly. 11 years. Did you ever actually suspect me, or did you just decide not to look? Give me the boy, Roman said. In a moment. Victor's eyes went back to Elena. Your company is impressive, genuinely. The Kellner contract analysis was thorough. You identified layers that took me months to build. A pause. You were also looking exactly where I wanted you to look, so it's somewhat relative. I know, Elena said. The referral chain, the Atlanta prosecutor, and your infrastructure contact. Something moved in Victor's face. Small, quick. She caught it and filed it. He hadn't been certain she'd worked that out. He'd assumed it, but he hadn't been certain. The drive Roman gave you, Victor said. The metadata documentation, Did you verify it? Yes. And? It's real. He nodded slowly. Roman has been collecting evidence against me for 14 months. I've known about it for 11. Do you want to know why I let him keep collecting it? Neither of them answered. Because the documentation he has, as comprehensive as it is missing the one component that makes it actionable in federal court. He paused with the timing of someone who had rehearsed this. The account structures that anchor the entire network are registered under a layered ownership chain that terminates in a trust instrument, a trust that has a single named beneficiary. He looked at Elena. That beneficiary is you. The words landed in the facility's flat industrial air, and Elena heard them, and her brain received them, and for 3 seconds she simply processed, not reacted, processed, the way she'd trained herself, because reaction before processing got people killed. That's not possible, she said. It's been possible for about 4 years. It was a contingency I built when I identified you as a potential future problem. If you stayed gone and stayed quiet, the trust stayed dormant and harmless. If you became active, he gestured slightly with one hand, then everything your company has been investigating for the past 3 weeks can be reframed as a principal examining her own assets. Roman said, that's fabricated, with a flatness that barely covered something underneath. Of course it is. So is the recording I made of Elena 5 years ago. Victor looked at him. And you believed that one completely. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has mass. Roman's breathing had changed. Elena heard it change. A shallowing, a quickening, the physical signature of a man processing something that was hitting him in more than one place at once. A gunshot came from the east side of the building, then 2 more in rapid succession, Marcus and the loading dock. Victor didn't flinch. He raised his voice only slightly. Bring the boy. One of the 2 men flanking Noah moved to take his arm. Noah, 5 years old, zip-tied, having sat still with extraordinary discipline for what must have been nearly an hour, did something that Elena both recognized and had absolutely not instructed him to do. He went completely limp the moment the man touched him, dropping his full body weight without warning in the way that children can and adults forget how to, making himself as difficult to move as a bag of wet sand. It bought 4 seconds. Elena moved in those 4 seconds. She didn't go for the man handling Noah. She went left, hard and fast, putting a column between herself and Victor's position, drawing her weapon as she moved. She heard Victor shout something and heard feet moving behind her, and she came around the column low and got a clear angle on the man nearest to Noah, who had not expected her to move toward him at all, and was still recalibrating when she put a round into his right knee and he went down sideways, away from Noah, which was the only trajectory that mattered. Roman had moved on Victor. She didn't see it, she heard it, a collision, grappling, Victor's voice saying something clipped and furious. The man who'd been behind Elena near the entrance was moving, and she tracked him by sound and the movement at the edge of her peripheral and came back around the column and was on him before he had an angle on her, using the compact closed-distance techniques that Dex Calloway had spent 2 years teaching her, and the man was bigger than her and trained, and it was not clean. It wasn't the kind of thing you saw in films where it was clean, where the smaller person neutralizes the larger one in 5 seconds without cost. She took a hit across her left cheekbone that filled her vision with white for a half second, and she took it and kept moving because stopping was worse. And she got her arm around his weapon hand and twisted with everything she had until something gave, and he made a sound, and the weapon hit the floor, and she put him down with a blow to his throat that was harder than she'd have liked and left him gagging on the concrete. Her cheek was screaming. She didn't slow down. From the north side of the building, 2 of Roman's people came in through what sounded like a window breach, and the facility suddenly had much more happening in it than Victor had deployed for, which was the entirety of the plan, such as it was. Not tactical elegance, just the application of enough chaos fast enough to break his containment. Noah. She was at his chair. Her hands found his wrists, found the zip tie, and she didn't have cutters, but she had the blade she kept in her belt, and she had it out and through the tie in one motion. Can you walk? Yes. His voice was entirely steady. She pulled back far enough to look at his face, and he looked at her with those eyes that were Roman's eyes in Elena's face and said, I stayed still, like you always say. You did perfect. She got him to his feet. Stay right behind me, hand on my jacket. You don't let go. Okay? Gunfire on the east side. Marcus trading shots with someone at the loading dock. The reports short and controlled on his side, more frantic on the other. Solis from the west access, his voice carrying, "Clear on west, moving in." Elena moved with Noah toward the south wall, away from the active exchanges, toward a position behind a cluster of conveyor supports that gave them coverage and a sight line to the main entrance. She put Noah behind the largest column and put herself between him and the room. She could see Roman and Victor. They were 40 feet away near the center of the floor, and the grappling had resolved into something uglier. Victor was bleeding from somewhere on his face. Roman had landed something, and Roman was moving with a stiffness on his left side that meant he'd taken damage there. They were not fighting the way trained fighters fight in controlled conditions. They were fighting the way men fight when it's personal, inefficiently, with rage poorly contained under the operational surface, making choices driven by something older than tactics. Victor got Roman against a support column with a forearm across his throat, and Elena raised her weapon and had a clear shot and couldn't take it because the angle was wrong, Roman too close, and she was moving laterally to improve the angle when Solis came in from the west and put 3 rapid shots into the space around Victor that made him release and roll, and the dynamic broke apart. Victor came up from the roll with a weapon she hadn't seen before, compact, drawn from a position she hadn't tracked. And he aimed it not at Roman, not at Solis, not at Elena. He aimed it at the column Noah was behind. "Stop," he said. Everyone stopped. The facility noise settled into a specific quality of silence. 3 exchanges still possibly active at the loading dock, but in this space, in this 40-foot radius, the word "stop" and the weapon's direction had produced a stillness with hard edges. Noah was behind the column. Elena had moved 12 feet away from him, trying to improve her angle on Victor, and now those 12 feet were 12 feet she could not close without Victor adjusting his aim. Roman was 7 feet from Victor, left side visibly compromised, weapon lost somewhere in the grappling. His hands were at shoulder height, a posture she'd never seen on Roman Viscari in her life, and the combination of it, his hands raised, his face, the specific quality of his stillness, told her he had arrived at the same understanding she had, that Victor was not going to negotiate, that the weapon aimed at that column was not a bluff, that he had brought them here for a specific conclusion and was still intending to reach it. Victor looked at Elena. "Put it down." She kept her weapon up. "You put a gun down on a man like Victor Soren, you don't get it back," Dex Calloway had told her once in a slightly different context, and she had filed it, and here it was, the exact circumstance, the exact calculation. "I will not count," Victor said. "I don't do counts. You know what I'll do." She knew. Marcus's voice from the east side of the building. "Elena." Just her name, a specific tone. She'd worked with him long enough to read what it meant. "I have an angle. Tell me." Victor heard it too. His eyes moved toward the sound briefly, and in that fraction of a second Roman lunged. He crossed 7 feet with his left side, screaming. She could see the cost of it in his face. And he hit Victor from the side with his shoulder, the way a person hits something when they've stopped thinking about preservation and started thinking about something else entirely. The weapon discharged. The shot went wide and high, into the ceiling, and Elena moved the moment it fired, covering the 12 feet to the column and getting her body between Noah and the room in a movement that was not elegant and not controlled and was entirely maternal. They hit the floor together, her left arm around Noah, her right hand still holding the weapon, her body over his. No impact. The shot had gone into the ceiling. She raised her head. Roman and Victor were on the floor. Roman was on top and his left arm was working badly, the compromised side, but his right arm was functional and he was using it, and Victor was moving beneath him, still moving, and then Victor's weapon arm came free and it was angled upward toward Roman's body, and Elena said, "Roman!" sharp and loud, and fired twice at Victor's weapon arm from the floor. She didn't miss. Victor's arm dropped. He made a sound that was high and shocked, the involuntary sound of sudden pain, and his weapon clattered, and Roman got clear of him, and Solis was there in the next instant, and Marcus in the one after that, and within 30 seconds, Victor Soren was on his back on the concrete floor of his own facility, with his weapon arm useless, and 3 people standing over him, and more of Roman's people coming through multiple access points simultaneously. The facility became, very quickly, a place where he had no more moves. Elena sat up from the floor. Noah scrambled up right beside her, unhurt, grass stains still on his track pants, looking at the scene in the room with the wide, careful eyes of a child who was frightened and trying hard not to be, which was so specific a quality, so precisely him, that she had to hold very still for a moment before she could speak. "Hey." She put her hands on his face. "Hey, look at me." He looked at her. His lower lip was doing something he was clearly fighting to control. "You're okay," she said. "It's done. You're okay." He held it for 2 more seconds. Then he stopped fighting it and leaned forward into her shoulder, and she held him. And he cried the way children cry when the fear they've been compressing finally finds a release, hard and brief, and then quieting. And she kept her hand on the back of his head and her eyes on the room. Roman had made it to a support column. He was leaning against it, right hand pressed to his left side, which was dark. His face was the color of old concrete. He was looking at her and Noah across the room, and his expression was not readable in any straightforward way. It was layered and complicated and had loss and something else in it she couldn't name cleanly from this distance. Marcus crouched beside Victor. "Federal authorities are 6 minutes out," he said, loud enough for the room. "I made the call 4 minutes ago." He looked at Victor's face. "You're going to want to keep that arm still." Victor said nothing. His eyes were on the ceiling. They were the eyes of a man who had run 17 layers of contingencies and arrived at an outcome he hadn't fully planned for, and the quality of his expression was not fear exactly. It was the specific blankness of someone who is rapidly dismantling assumptions they'd held about themselves. Elena stood. Noah's hand found hers and she held it, both of them looking at Victor on the floor, and she said nothing. There was nothing to say that the situation didn't already say with more precision than words could manage. Roman pushed off the column and took 2 steps toward her and stopped. The blood at his side had soaked through to his jacket. His breathing was labored and controlled. He was managing it deliberately, the way people manage physical pain when they need to stay upright and functional for a few more minutes, regardless of what it costs. "The fabricated trust instrument," he said. His voice was rough. "I'll have documentation that counters it within—" "I know you will," she said. He stopped talking. He looked at her and Noah, at the small hand in hers, at the blue windbreaker and the grass stains. And something crossed his face that was too large for the moment to contain cleanly. Sirens reached them from outside, distant, closing. Elena looked at Roman's side. "You need to sit down." "I'm fine." "You're not. Sit down before you fall down." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he sat down against the column, slowly, with the controlled care of someone who knows that fast movements right now will end their vertical status entirely. And he looked across the concrete floor at the man who had spent 11 years inside his organization building a machine designed to destroy it, and his face went through several things and settled on something that wasn't quite any of the words for what it was. The sirens were close now. Victor Soren was still looking at the ceiling. Noah tightened his hand around Elena's fingers, and she tightened back, and the facility held all of them in its industrial quiet while the world outside came closer 1 second at a time. The federal agents came through the main entrance 4 minutes after the sirens reached the building, which was fast enough that Elena understood Marcus had given them more than a location. He'd given them a prepared package, the kind of documentation that told arriving law enforcement exactly what they were walking into and who was who and why, so that nobody made the kind of mistake that happens when armed people enter a chaotic space without context. She had her weapon holstered and her hands visible when they came through the door, and Noah was beside her with his hand still in hers, and she said her name clearly and said, "I'm the one who called this in through Marcus Webb." And the lead agent, a woman, 30s, moving with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd run these entries before, looked at her and looked at Noah and made a quick assessment and said, "Secure the boy first," to the agent behind her, which was the right call, and told Elena something useful about the quality of person she was dealing with. Noah went with a young agent who had the good sense to get down to his level immediately and talk to him like a person rather than a situation to be managed. Elena watched them move to the south wall, and then she turned back to the room. Roman was still against the column. 2 of his people had stayed near him. The others had melted out through the access points they'd come in through, which was appropriate and which Elena had anticipated. The ones who stayed were making a statement, "We're not running," which given what was about to happen was either loyalty or calculation, or both. Victor was still on the floor, Someone had zip-tied his wrists. She noticed Solis's particular knotwork and filed a small, grim acknowledgement of the irony. His weapon arm had been field-dressed with someone's jacket sleeve wrapped tight above the elbow, which was keeping him alive and functional enough to be conscious and present for what came next. He had not spoken since the sirens arrived. He was staring at the ceiling with the specific quality of a man who is doing rapid internal accounting and not liking the totals. Marcus was at the east side of the building on his phone, delivering what sounded like a pre-prepared statement in the clipped professional register he used when he was talking to people who needed information in a specific format. She caught fragments. Financial documentation transmitted to your office at 0740 this morning. FinCEN analyst Dana Marsh is currently in federal protective custody. Full ownership chain with metadata verification. Dana Marsh. Elena had almost forgotten about Marsh in the compressed violence of the last 2 hours. Yara had gotten her out of the parking garage. She was somewhere safe. That thread was not loose. The lead agent, she identified herself as Agent Rourke, came to Elena after a few minutes, and they stood near the south wall, and Rourke asked questions in a sequence that told Elena she'd been briefed on the financial case already, which meant someone in the federal chain had moved on Marcus's documentation faster than Elena had expected. "Victor Soren," Rourke said. "How long have you known he was here?" "I identified the facility from operational documentation approximately 4 hours ago." Elena kept her answers tight. "The kidnapping of my son was the mechanism used to bring me here. I have reason to believe Mr. Soren intended to use my presence and Mr. Vescry's to create a narrative in which we appeared to be principals in the financial network rather than people investigating it. The fabricated trust instrument. Yes, we're aware of it. The documentation you submitted this morning includes the server metadata that establishes the fabrication timeline." Rourke glanced toward Victor on the floor. "It's not going to hold up." "I know," Elena said. Rourke looked at her for a moment with the particular assessing quality of someone who is deciding how much of what they're thinking to say out loud. Then, "Your son wasn't hurt." "No." Given the circumstances, that's a significant outcome." She said it with a directness that acknowledged more than the words contained, and Elena received it the same way. "Yes," she said. "It is." Across the room, 2 agents were helping Roman to his feet, and he was not making it easy for them. Not because he was resisting, but because his left side was worse than he'd been admitting, and the movement required was costing him in ways that showed. He got upright. He stood. His eyes found Elena across the space and held for a moment, and then he looked at Rourke beside her, and his face shifted into the careful neutral register of a man who understands that what he says in the next several hours will matter in ways that extend years into the future. "Mr. Vescary," Rourke said, moving toward him, "I'm going to need you to come with us." "I know," Roman said. "I'll cooperate fully." He looked at the agent beside him. "I need 5 minutes." Rourke assessed him. 2 minutes. Roman walked toward Elena. He moved carefully, the left side managed, and he stopped at a distance that felt measured, close enough for a private exchange, far enough to be unambiguous about what this was and wasn't. "The documentation I promised, everything you need is in it," he spoke quietly. "Every internal operative, every turned relationship, every channel Victor used that connects to a legitimate institution. It's all there." "I know," Marcus confirmed it this morning. "The fabricated trust. My attorneys will have counter-documentation filed before end-of-day Monday. It won't touch your company." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Noah across the room, at the young agent who had produced what appeared to be a granola bar from somewhere, and was sitting on the floor with him, the two of them in some kind of negotiation about the granola bar that Noah was apparently winning. "He stayed still," Roman said, "through all of it." "He does that." Elena watched her son. "He gets it from his grandmother, I think. My mother. She could sit in the middle of a crisis with a coffee cup and just wait it out." A pause. "You never met her?" "No." "She died 3 years ago. She knew about Noah. I sent her photographs." Elena looked at Roman. "I didn't tell her who his father was. I didn't think it was relevant." Roman received that without flinching, which took something. Did she know you were okay where you were?" "Eventually, after the first year." Elena looked back at Noah. "She was angry at me for a long time for not coming home. I couldn't explain to her why I couldn't. She understood eventually, in her way. A pause. She would have been angry at you too, for what it's worth. That seems appropriate, Roman said. Agent Rourke was making a gesture from across the room. Time. Roman looked at Elena. He looked at her the way you look at something you've been trying to memorize and keep running out of time for. I'm going to be in federal proceedings for a long time. Cooperation agreements, asset surrender, testimony. I won't be... He stopped. Reorganized. I won't ask for anything. I'm not in a position to ask for anything. I just need you to know that whatever happens from here, everything I did tonight, the documentation, coming here, it wasn't strategy. It wasn't another move. Elena looked at him. I know, she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just with the particular weight of someone who has assessed a thing from multiple angles and arrived at a conclusion. Roman nodded once. Then he walked toward Agent Rourke and the two agents flanking her, and he went with them without looking back. And Elena watched him go and did not move until he was through the main entrance and the cold air from outside closed the space where he'd been. Noah appeared beside her. He had half a granola bar in one hand. He leaned against her hip, and she put her arm around his shoulders, and they stood together in the industrial quiet. Is that man going to jail? Noah said. She looked down at him. Which man? The one on the floor. Yes. He absorbed this, took a bite of granola bar. The other man, the one who was hurt. Elena was quiet for a moment. He's in trouble. He has to go talk to a lot of people and work some things out. Noah was quiet. Then, he looked at me a lot. Did he? Like he was checking if I was okay. Another pause. Is he somebody? Elena looked at the main entrance where Roman had gone, at the cold air coming through the gap where the door hadn't quite closed. Yes, she said. He's somebody. Noah looked up at her with a question in his face that he seemed to decide wasn't yet the right moment for. And she was grateful for that quality in him, the instinct for timing that she suspected he had from both sides. He went back to the granola bar. You said pancakes tomorrow, he said. I did. It's tomorrow now. It's morning. She looked at the high, narrow windows. The light coming through them had changed while they'd been inside. It was past dawn. The sky outside was the particular gray-white of early morning after a night with no clear resolution, the kind of sky that was withholding judgment. Pancakes? She said. Yes. He leaned against her hip again, apparently satisfied, and she stood in the remains of Victor Soren's facility with her arm around her son and waited for Marcus to tell her what came next. What came next was 3 weeks that felt like 3 months. The federal case against Victor Soren moved with unusual speed, which Elena understood to be a function of the documentation quality Marcus had delivered, and the fact that Dana Marsh, given protective custody and a cooperation agreement that her attorneys negotiated with impressive speed, turned out to have records of her own that added 3 additional layers of evidentiary specificity to a case that was already unusually well documented. Marsh was facing significant exposure, and she knew it, and she had apparently decided that the only viable path forward was to be more useful to the government than anyone else in the network, a calculation that meant she handed over everything: records, communications, a personal log she'd been keeping for 8 months as what she described to investigators as an insurance policy she'd hoped never to need. Elena sat across from one of the lead prosecutors, a careful man named Halverson, on 3 separate occasions in the first 2 weeks. She brought Marcus to all 3 meetings. She brought her own attorneys to 2 of them. She answered questions with the same compressed precision she'd used with Agent Rourke, and she produced documentation when asked for it, and she did not volunteer anything that wasn't directly responsive to a question, which was what her attorneys had advised, and which also happened to be how she processed most situations involving people who held institutional authority over her circumstances. The fabricated trust instrument was dismantled in the first week. Roman's attorneys filed counter-documentation on Monday as promised, and the metadata analysis that Yara had prepared was entered into the federal record, and the combination was enough to remove it from any serious consideration as an evidentiary tool. Victor's attorneys attempted to argue that the fabrication claim was itself a fabrication, which was the move Elena had expected, and which lasted approximately as long as it took Halverson's team to walk the judge through the server chain and the synthesis algorithm documentation. Victor Sorin entered a not guilty plea and said nothing further through his attorney. His weapon arm had required surgery. He was in custody without bail, which the judge had ordered after a bail hearing in which the government presented 3 pages of flight risk analysis that included 11 countries where Sorin held assets under various names. His expression in the courtroom photographs that ran in the Tribune was the same expression he'd had looking at the ceiling of his own facility, a specific contained blankness that Elena suspected would be his face for a long time to come. She saw the photographs in passing and did not seek them out again. Roman's cooperation agreement was negotiated over 10 days, and the terms, when Marcus summarized them for her, were what she'd expected: full asset surrender, testimony in the Sorin case, and in 3 related federal investigations involving the network's partner organizations in Montreal and Miami, a guilty plea on 2 conspiracy charges that carried sentences which would be substantially reduced based on cooperation credit, and a provision regarding the dismantling of the remaining Vescari organizational infrastructure that was being supervised by a federal monitor. She heard all of this from Marcus. She did not hear it from Roman. He sent one message, through his attorney, in the second week. It was brief, and it said, "Counter documentation filed as promised. Trust instrument removed from federal record. Your company is clean. I'm sorry it took this long to owe you something worth paying." She read it. She didn't respond. Not because she had nothing to say, because what she had to say wasn't something that belonged in a message filtered through an attorney's office, and she wasn't yet sure it was something that belonged anywhere, in any medium, at any point in the foreseeable future. Marlowe Global Security had an all-hands meeting on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the facility. Elena stood at the front of the conference room and looked at the 6 people seated at the table: Marcus, Yara, Solis, and 3 others who had been part of the operational response in various capacities. And she said what needed to be said, which was that the Kellner contract had been a constructed approach designed to expose the company to liability and to redirect the investigation away from what mattered, and that it had partially worked, and that the partial failure was hers. Marcus started to say something. "Let me finish," she said. She said that the partial failure was hers because she had allowed a personal connection to the subject matter to slow the process by which she'd brought the full team into confidence with the complete picture, and that going forward the protocol regarding disclosure within the core team was changing to address that gap. She said this without softening it or redirecting the responsibility toward anyone else in the room, and she held eye contact through the full delivery, and when she was done, she waited. Marcus said, "The documentation outcome and the federal case outcome suggest the overall response was effective." "The documentation outcome was effective," Elena said. "The outcome that matters most to me personally, Noah's exposure, was a direct result of the gap I described. Those are 2 separate things." The room was quiet for a moment. Yara said, "Are you okay?" Elena looked at her. Of all the things she'd been asked in the past 2 weeks, by federal prosecutors, by her attorneys, by the FBI agent who'd conducted a follow-up interview, by Carla, who had asked it 4 separate times in 4 separate tones, that question from Yara was the one that sat differently. Because Yara asked it without an agenda attached to the answer. She just wanted to know. "Not entirely," Elena said, "but that's a separate meeting." That got a small, real laugh from around the table, and the tension shifted, not disappeared, but shifted into something workable. And they moved into the operational review portion of the meeting, and Elena led it with the same precision she always led it with, which was the best answer she knew how to give to the question of whether she was okay. Pete and Carla came to dinner 3 weeks after the facility. This had been planned before everything happened, and Elena had considered canceling it, and then decided that canceling things because something terrible had nearly happened was not a pattern she was willing to establish. Pete made pasta. He was a better cook than he generally let on, which Elena suspected was a deliberate strategy for managing expectations. Noah sat beside him at the kitchen counter during the preparation phase and was given the task of tearing bread into a bowl, which he approached with enormous seriousness and a quantity of personal consumption that diminished the bread in the bowl substantially before it reached the table. Carla sat with Elena in the living room while the food came together in the kitchen, and they had wine, and Carla said, I've been thinking about what I want to say to you for 3 weeks, and I still don't know. And Elena said, then don't say it. And Carla said, I think I need to say some of it. Elena held her wine glass. Okay. I was terrified, Carla said. I know you know that. But I need you to understand what it felt like from inside this house that morning, with Pete making coffee and Noah watching cartoons, and then the door. Pete didn't even have time to... She stopped. She was not someone who cried easily, and she was not crying now, but she was close to the line in a way Elena recognized. He's okay. Noah's okay. I know that. I needed to say that it was the most frightening morning of my life, and that I love that boy like he was mine, and that if anything had... I know, Elena said. Do you? Because you do this thing where you process things so fast and so efficiently that I sometimes wonder if you actually let yourself... Carla, I'm saying I worry about you. Elena looked at her. Carla, who had driven to a laundromat in the middle of the night without asking why. Carla, who had housed them for 6 months before Elena had the resources to establish anything of her own, who had sent pictures to Elena's mother and covered for her with people who asked questions, who had stood in the driveway of this life Elena had built and said, be careful on the way in and pancakes on the way out. I know you do, Elena said, and I know I don't make it easy. No, Carla agreed. You really don't. I'm working on it. Carla looked at her for a moment. The man, Roman. She said the name carefully, like something with uncertain weight. Is he? He's in cooperation proceedings. He'll be for a while. And after that? Elena looked at her wine glass. I don't know. Do you want to know? After that? The question sat in the room. From the kitchen came the sound of Noah explaining something to Pete with considerable authority, Pete's patient responses, the smell of garlic and olive oil coming through the doorway. I don't know that either, Elena said. Carla nodded slowly. She accepted this the way she accepted most things about Elena, without pushing for a tidier answer, without needing the resolution to arrive on a schedule she could anticipate. It was one of the reasons Elena had been able to maintain the friendship across 5 years of a life that didn't permit most relationships to survive its specific pressures. He's his father's eyes, Carla said quietly. Not an accusation, just an observation she'd apparently been holding for a while. I know, Elena said. Noah doesn't know? Not yet. When? When it's the right moment, which isn't a thing I can schedule. She looked toward the kitchen. He asked me if Roman was somebody. The morning of, in the facility. After. What did you tell him? I said yes. Carla was quiet. Then, that's a start. Dinner was good. Pete had outdone himself and accepted their acknowledgement of this with modest deflection that didn't quite hide how pleased he was. Noah ate more than seemed plausible for someone his size, and then fell asleep on the couch during the post-dinner conversation, which he did sometimes with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a child who trusts entirely that the adults around him will handle things while he's unavailable. Elena watched him sleep and felt something that she didn't try to name precisely. It was too large and too mixed for a single name, compounded of relief and residual fear and love so physical it was almost indistinguishable from pain. She drove home carefully, the way she always drove with Noah in the car, and she carried him up to his room and got him into bed without fully waking him. And she stood in the doorway of his room for a moment in the dark, the white noise machine running its steady hiss. And she did what she'd done at the beginning of all of this, in a laundromat at 3 a.m. with torn palms and nowhere to go. She let herself be exactly where she was for a moment, without strategy, without the next 5 moves already calculated. Just a woman standing in a doorway looking at her sleeping child and breathing. It didn't last long, it wasn't supposed to. But it happened, and that was enough. The letter from Roman arrived 6 weeks after the facility, forwarded through his attorney's office with a note explaining that it was personal correspondence unrelated to the legal proceedings, and that it had been cleared by both parties' counsel. Elena didn't open it for 3 days. She put it on her desk and looked at it occasionally and continued working, because the work continued regardless of what was on her desk. She opened it on a Sunday morning while Noah was at soccer practice with Carla sitting on the sideline in her stead. The letter was handwritten. She hadn't expected that. Roman Viscari's handwriting was not what she would have predicted. It was careful and slightly angular, and the letters were well formed in a way that suggested he had once been taught penmanship by someone who meant it. He wrote that he was not going to use the letter to relitigate what had happened or to make claims about his intentions or his state of mind 5 years ago, that he'd said what he had to say about that in a warehouse, and she'd received it in the way that was right for her to receive it, and he wasn't going to press. He wrote that the cooperation proceedings were proceeding and that his attorneys estimated the disposition timeline and that he was not going to minimize what the outcome meant in terms of years and conditions and constraints on his life going forward, that he had made choices, and choices had architecture, and he was living inside that architecture now. He wrote that he had been told, through appropriate channels, that Noah was well. He wrote that he was aware he didn't have a right to more than the information that Noah was well, and that he was not asking for more than that. He wrote that if, at some point, at some future point that Elena determined and on conditions Elena set, Noah knew who he was, he would consider that a form of grace he hadn't earned. Then he wrote one paragraph at the end that was different from the rest, in some quality of register, some slight unguardedness in the syntax, the place where the preparation ran out and something more unmediated came through. He wrote, "I've been thinking about what you said in the warehouse, about your mother, that she was angry at you for a long time and then understood, in her way. I think about how you managed that, the not going back when going back was the thing that probably would have been easier and safer and didn't require you to build an entire capability from scratch in order to make it through. I don't think I have understood until recently, until the proceedings started and I started having a great deal of time to think about what a life looks like when you take all the power out of it and sit with what's left. What it actually costs to be the kind of person who goes through a thing like that and comes out the other side still standing and still clear about who you are. I'm not saying this to ask you for anything. I'm saying it because I spent 6 years knowing you and 4 of those years being married to you, and I don't think I saw it until now. I think you deserve better than what I gave you. I think that's probably obvious, but I wanted to say it in writing, without an attorney in the room, because obvious things still need to be said sometimes." Elena read the paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in the desk drawer, underneath the Cypress analysis documents that she hadn't yet filed, and the case closure summary for the Kellner contract in a drawing. Noah had made the previous week of what he'd described as a shark driving a car, which she'd put on the desk because it made her smile without fail. She didn't respond to the letter. Not yet. She wasn't sure yet whether she was going to respond or what responding would open, and whether opening that was something she was ready for. She was honest with herself about that uncertainty, which was what she tried to be about things she couldn't resolve quickly. Patient with the uncertainty, resistant to the pressure to settle it before it was ready to be settled. The work continued. Marlowe Global Security expanded its operations in the 7 months following the Soren case with a speed that surprised even Elena, who had modeled several growth scenarios and placed the current trajectory in her optimistic projection band. The federal case had generated attention she hadn't sought and didn't particularly want, but attention of a specific kind, the kind that came from organizations with legitimate protection needs and complex threat environments that her competitors handled with variable quality. She hired 3 new senior analysts. She brought on a legal team. She formalized the relationship with Dex Calloway that had been operating informally for 5 years, giving him an official advisory role that he accepted with the particular combination of pleasure and pretended reluctance she'd come to understand was his standard mode for receiving good news. She took on work she believed in and declined work she didn't, which was a luxury she'd earned through the years of taking every contract that kept the lights on, regardless of how she felt about it. She built intake protocols that screened for the specific kind of work she wanted to do: protective services for people without resources, intelligence support for whistleblower organizations, financial forensics for nonprofits, investigating corruption in their sector. It was not the only work Marlowe Global did, but it was the work that went into the part of the client list she looked at with something resembling what she thought satisfaction probably felt like. Marcus ran the day-to-day operations with increasing autonomy, which was a management evolution Elena had been moving toward for 2 years, and which accelerated when she acknowledged to herself that she was better at building and strategizing than she was at the daily administrative rhythm, and that this was not a failure but a fact, and that the right response to a fact was to structure around it. She told Marcus this directly. He said, "I've been waiting for you to figure that out for about 1.5 years," with a dryness that suggested he'd thought about how he would say it when the moment came. "Why didn't you say something?" Because you needed to get there yourself, he said. Some people you can push. You're not one of them. She thought about that for a while afterward. She wasn't sure whether it was a compliment or a specific kind of criticism, or just an observation offered without agenda. She concluded it was probably all three simultaneously, which was Marcus's characteristic mode, and she accepted it in the spirit in which it seemed to be offered. Noah started first grade in September. He came home the first day and reported the events of the day with a completeness and organizational clarity that his teacher, when Elena mentioned it at a subsequent conference, confirmed was unusual for his age group. He had made one friend, a boy named Marcus, which Elena found privately amusing and didn't mention to Noah because at 6 years old the coincidence of a name was not a meaningful pattern, and she didn't want to make it one. He was good at math in the specific way that meant he understood the structure of it intuitively rather than just the procedures. He was a difficult writer, not because he lacked ideas, but because he had more ideas than the process of writing could contain at his current skill level, and the frustration this produced was a thing Elena recognized with a familiarity that was both useful and slightly exhausting to navigate. He asked about his father for the first time in October, which was later than Elena had expected and earlier than she'd felt prepared for, which was probably the right timing for most things of significance. They were in the kitchen after school. He was eating an apple in the particular aggressive way he ate apples, as though the apple had somehow offended him, and she was going through the week's schedule on her laptop, and he said without preamble, "Where's my dad?" Elena closed the laptop. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the checking quality he had. The same quick assessment she'd noticed at soccer practice, the need to read the room before committing to a position. "That's an important question," she said. "I know." He took another bite. "Marcus at school says his dad makes pancakes. I wondered if mine did." Elena sat back in her chair. She had thought about this conversation in the abstract for 5 years, had held it at a distance, and then, after the facility, had held it a little less far and told herself she would be ready when it arrived. She was not ready. She wasn't sure readiness was something that was actually available for this. "Your dad is a person I knew a long time ago," she said, "before you were born. He made some choices that were hard. They hurt people, including me. He's been dealing with the consequences of those choices." Noah ate his apple and thought about this. "Is he bad?" Elena looked at her son, at Roman's eyes in her face, at the quality of stillness he had when something mattered, the capacity for patience that she was still, after 6 years, slightly astonished to find in a small child. "He did bad things," she said carefully. "He also did some things later that were not bad. That took real courage." She paused. "People are usually both. The people who are only one thing are rare." Noah absorbed this with the judicial seriousness she'd long stopped being surprised by. "Does he know about me?" "He does now." "Did you tell him?" "Not exactly. He found out." She paused. "He would like to meet you someday, if you want that." She watched his face. "But that's something you get to decide, and there's no hurry to decide it." Noah ate the last of his apple down to the core. He looked at the core for a moment, then set it on the table. "Does he make pancakes?" he said. Elena looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I honestly have no idea." "That's an important thing to find out," Noah said, with the gravity of someone stating a self-evident truth, and slid off his chair and went to find his backpack. Elena sat in the kitchen for another minute. Then she opened her laptop. Then she closed it again. She opened the desk drawer in her home office that evening and took out Roman's letter and read it one more time, the last paragraph particularly. And she sat with it for a while, and when she was done sitting with it, she got out a piece of paper and wrote 2 sentences. She wrote, "Noah wants to know if you make pancakes. That question can be a starting point, if you want one." She sealed it and addressed it and put it on the counter to mail in the morning. She was not sure it was the right thing. She was not sure it was the wrong thing. It was a door opened a specific amount, with specific light coming through it, and what came through that door would be determined by things she couldn't fully control or predict, which was true of most things that mattered, and had always been true and would remain true regardless of how sophisticated her threat assessment capabilities became. She went to check on Noah and found him asleep again with the lights on and a book open on his chest. A book about marine biology that he'd gotten from the library and was reading with the intense personal investment he brought to anything involving animals that had adaptations for extreme environments. She took the book carefully and put the bookmark in and turned out the light and stood for a moment in the doorway. She thought about a gate closing, about rain on concrete and torn palms and a laundromat at 3 in the morning, about Carla driving without headlights in the dark and Dex Calloway asking her questions instead of answering them, and a drive full of metadata that verified something she'd known was true for 5 years. About a man taking 2 steps toward her in a warehouse and stopping at the right distance because he understood the distance wasn't his to close. About Noah in a chair with his hands zip-tied saying, "I stayed still like you always say," with a voice so steady it still landed somewhere under her sternum every time she thought about it. She thought about what Victor Soren had built, and why, and what it cost, and what it had cost her, and the specific cold fact that the thing he'd built had come apart, not because it was badly constructed, it was meticulously constructed, but because the people it was designed to neutralize had not stayed in the positions they'd been assigned. Elena had not stayed gone. Roman had not stayed complicit. Even Dana Marsh in the parking garage had made the calculation that the architecture of what she'd been part of was no longer worth the structural weight of staying inside it. People didn't stay in the positions they were assigned. That was both the fundamental problem and the fundamental resource of any situation involving human beings. She had built 5 years on that principle without exactly articulating it to herself in those terms. She turned off the light and walked down the hall and made herself a cup of tea. She mostly didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment and let the evening settle into night around her. It was raining, not hard, a steady, even rain, the kind the city in November produced without drama, without announcement. She could hear it against the windows. She listened to it for a while. 5 years ago, rain had meant a closed gate and nobody coming. It had meant men in dark coats and wet pavement and nowhere to go. And she had walked into it with nothing, and it had made her into something she'd subsequently spent 5 years learning to understand and live inside. Now rain was rain. It hit the windows and ran down the glass and collected in the street below and eventually went somewhere else. And the city continued, and the apartment was warm, and somewhere down the hall, Noah was asleep with his marine biology book properly bookmarked on the nightstand. She wrapped her hands around the teacup. Outside, the rain kept coming down over the city, over the south branch of the river and the industrial districts and the places where things had happened that were now in federal evidence records and personal histories and the permanent alteration of several lives. Over Oak Park, where Carla was probably also awake at this hour, the way she sometimes was, Pete asleep beside her, the house quiet. Over federal holding facilities and law offices and the accumulated consequences of choices made over years by people who had believed, each in their own way, that they could construct reality according to their specifications. Nobody could construct reality according to their specifications. You could build. You could protect. You could be deliberate and skilled and relentlessly prepared, and then the world would do what the world did, and you would respond to it with whatever you'd managed to become by that point. And the quality of what you'd become was the only variable that was actually yours to work with. Elena had worked with it. She had built something she was not ashamed of. She had raised someone she looked at with a bewilderment of love that was not, she had decided, something to be managed or kept at professional distance, but rather something to be allowed its full weight. Because some things were supposed to be heavy, and that weight was not a vulnerability but the whole point. She thought about a letter on its way to a man who was living inside the architecture of his choices, and had made 2 sentences the basis of something that might or might not become more than 2 sentences, and she held that uncertainty with less resistance than she would have held it a year ago, 6 months ago, a week ago even. It was enough for tonight. The rain was enough. The quiet was enough. The tea going cold in her hands was enough. She took one last drink of it, cold as it was, and set the cup in the sink and turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming, which was not always true and was, when it happened, its own kind of gift. The ordinary mercy of a night that asked nothing of you but rest. Outside, the rain settled into something softer, barely perceptible by midnight, and by morning it had stopped completely. The sky that came with daylight was clear.